Well, it's a great pleasure for me to be here. This is my first visit to. This is my first visit to USC, despite the fact that I have known Professor Phil Syeed for a long time. How many years now? My talk today is going to try to answer the question of whether Islamic websites can serve as platforms for faith diplomacy. So I want to start with why it's important to study Islamic websites in the diplomacy context. There is a changing political landscape in the Arab part of the Islamic world today. Contrary to what the German Consul General mentioned earlier about the declining role of religion in Europe, there is no question that there is a growing role of religion in the Arab civil societies, not just in the political levels, but also in social levels. Take as an example the Muslim Brotherhood. They are playing an increasingly important role, and especially after the revolution in Egypt, I definitely would anticipate that the role is going to increase even more. And they are the most organized opposition group. They have been the most organized opposition group in Egypt. The same thing in Tunisia, the Al-Nahda party, the Renaissance party in Tunisia. Rashid Ghannouchi just came back. The head of that party came back to Tunisia after a long time in exile. So there is a need for hearing Muslims' voices in their own words. And Islam has to be studied through the Muslims' lenses, not through the Western's lenses. There is also a changing media landscape. And this, thanks to the new media, Muslims, especially young Muslims today, can have an opportunity to express their individual voices and be proud of their individual voices. And this is what I like to call citizen journalism in an Islamic context. The fact of the matter is, very little research has been conducted on what we call mainstream Islamic websites. Most of the research conducted here in the West has been focused on what we call the jihadist or the extremist websites. And the mainstream websites, which many of them go unnoticed, have a great following in the Arab and the Islamic world, as I'm going to mention later. Let me give you just a very quick synopsis of the online Muslim landscape in general. Today, there are thousands of Islamic websites. Some of these sites were launched by authoritative, conventional religious authorities like Al-Azhar institution in Egypt, as an extension of the message that they provide through traditional offline venues like mosques, while other sites have been launched by individuals, ordinary individuals, with no formal religious education, no training, to create an online public space for discourse about Islam. They definitely promise that kind of democratization that many Muslims have been deprived of in the offline world. But there is definitely a big downside to that, which is the threat of uninformed religious edicts or fatwas. This is what I like to call a chaotic marketplace of fatwas in the virtual world. Today, anybody with no religious education, nobody knows where this mufti came from. They just post a fatwa online, and many people who happen to follow that site, they just follow that fatwa blindly. I think this is very risky and very dangerous in today's virtual openness. I think I have to talk about the Ummah, or the global Muslim community. The term Ummah was mentioned in the Quran at least 62 times. And the Ummah basically means a community of believers that brings together not only all Muslims who are currently living, but also all past and future generations. Today, many Muslim clerics argue that the Ummah is at its weakest point. And I think this is because of the fact that there is no agreement and there is no unity on the political level. Maybe there is only the sense of spiritual unity, and I think the Hajj, or the pilgrimage, exemplifies that sense of spiritual unity. This is the event where millions of Muslims of different races, colors, and ethnic backgrounds come together to perform the same religious rituals in Saudi Arabia. This is when the imagined community, the imagined Ummah that Muslims have always envisioned, becomes part of a living reality. The interesting thing about the Ummah is that definitely the ideal Muslim Ummah is the one that encourages its members to engage in dialogue with other civilizations, and hence the importance of discussing the Ummah in the context of diplomacy. It's not just the Muslims dialoguing with each other. It's all Muslims and non-Muslims as the Muslim Ummah dictates since the days of the Prophet. Today there are actually three challenges facing the Ummah. One is the democratization challenge. There is no question that most governments, especially in the Arab parts of the Muslim world, have been authoritarian. They have been dictatorships. It's promising to see the revolutions taking place across the Arab world today, but we have to be very cautious because it's yet to be seen what's going to come out of these revolutions. It's very early to tell. And the higher the expectations, the higher the frustrations. Now there is a revolution of expectations. The revolutions have taken place on the ground, but now there is a new wave of revolutions, which is the revolution of expectations. The question now is how far can new voices and oppositional voices be heard? There is also the dialogue challenge, especially after 9/11. It's not a secret that members of the Muslim communities have been facing several challenges in engaging in dialogue. And the key term here is constructive dialogue. The question is not dialogue. People dialogue with each other. They engage in dialogue with each other all the time. The question is whether it's constructive or not, meaning is it going to lead to constructive solution to the gaps that exist currently in this discourse. And of course, there is the challenge of the diaspora. Muslim diaspora faces many challenges. The Imam can attest to that. I mean, many Muslim communities in the United States still debate whether to get an Imam from their home countries or an Imam from who is American born. The Imam from the home countries would have a problem connecting with second and third generation Muslims. The Imam who is American born, white American born Muslim Imam, usually a convert, would have a problem connecting with the immigrants. In fact, in my Muslim community, we are facing the exact same scenario right now. And it's very frustrating and very challenging. If the Muslim community cannot agree on what their mission, their agenda is in one single community in the United States, how can they agree on reaching out to other Muslims, not to mention non-Muslims, in the wider world? Of course, now, thanks to the internet, the digital or virtual ummah has been born. Internet technology is a key player in transforming the actual Islamic community into an imagined community in cyberspace. Before the internet, the Islamic agenda was mostly set by the traditional Muslim clerics who were kind of having a great say in what was going on in the Islamic public sphere. Today, there is a mix of voices through the virtual Islamic public sphere. Of course, participation in the virtual ummah has allowed for identitylessness. Being identityless in the virtual Islamic world has allowed for and encouraged diversity of opinions and has led to a multitude of opinions. But on the other hand, the cyber world has weakened the universality of the ummah even further. It's weakened to start with, but that has added another layer of weakness to it, of the divisiveness, by allowing for a volatile mix of competing opinions, including serious divisions over who speaks for Islam. Yes, Islam does not have, as Professor Brand mentioned earlier, Islam does not have a hierarchy of people to speak, who can officially speak on behalf of Islam. But now, with the virtual world, that's even becoming more complex, especially with the other people, other elements of speakers getting into the discourse. I actually had the pleasure of co-authoring a book with Dr. Sahar Khamis at the University of Maryland. The book title is Islam.com. Dot actually is spelled out, D-O-T, because there is a website called Islam.com, so for copyright issues. And I think dot is more neat to have D-O-T spelled out. Anyway, this book was part of the series, the political communication series by Palgrave Macmillan that Professor Sieb is editing. And in this book, we conducted textual analysis of three mainstream Islamic websites: islamonline.net, islamway.com, and amrkhalid.net. We used this qualitative textual analysis to study the dimensions of the Islamic virtual public sphere as represented in the deliberations taking place on the Arabic and English discussion boards of Islam Online and Islam Way, and the Arabic discussion board of Amr Khalid, which does not have an extended English discussion board. Our selection of these sites, out of the thousands of sites that are out there, were based simply on the ranking of Alexa.com. The ranking was very high for these three sites, ranging in fact between 500 and 1500. And this is pretty high by any standards, not just by religious website standards. I'm just going to give you a very brief synopsis of the three sites. Islam Online was established in 1997. Has been, and still is one of the leading Muslim sites on the internet, despite the fact that they had a problem with their team in Cairo, and their team actually they closed the bureau in Cairo. By the Al-Balagh company in Qatar that runs the site closed the team in Cairo, and the team in Cairo started another site which is called On Islam. But anyway, the site is still very popular. It was established thanks to the encouragement of a very prominent Muslim sheikh who is Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi. Yusuf al-Qaradawi has been very prominent, and his prominence has really skyrocketed thanks to his program, his weekly show on Al Jazeera. Al-Qaradawi belongs to the school of thought that is known as al-Wasatiyya, or moderation, which advocates modern and flexible interpretations of Islam that incorporate new social developments. And he sees that there is no contradiction between Islam and modern technology. The second site is amrkhalid.net. Amr Khalid site was launched in 2002. Amr Khalid is really, he's like a Muslim televangelist. He is Egyptian-born. You can compare him to Joel Osteen here. You all might, of course, minus the millions of dollars that Joel Osteen has, but that's not. But Amr Khalid is interesting because he has developed this huge popularity among people who have always been alienated by the traditional message coming from the traditional Muslim clerics. He was successful in getting to know, to connect with the young Muslims from the middle and upper classes in an unprecedented way. He started out in the physical world, not in the virtual world, by going out, reaching out to them, going to the social clubs, playing soccer with them, using the same technology that they use, and then he took that message to the virtual world. He did something very interesting, talking about diplomacy. A few years ago, in the height of the Danish cartoon controversy, you may remember, he took a team of youth, ordinary youth, from Egypt, and he visited Denmark to engage in this constructive dialogue. And he was really ostracized for that by many traditional Muslim clerics. The third site is Islam Way. And the Islam Way has no affiliation to any party. It was really hard to find any information on the homepage as to how this site was started, actually. But what I can say is the discussion forum on this site is limited to the Muslim sisters only, and it was mostly focused on social topics. Let me just talk briefly about some of the findings. The threads from the Arabic forums of Islam Online, Islam Way, and Amr Khalid were dominantly, they were predominantly overwhelmingly Arab and Muslim. There were no non-Arabs. There was hardly any non-Arab on these sites, given the language barrier, probably. But we found out that there was a strong sense of collective consciousness that emanated from the Arab and Islamic identities. There was a sense of pan-Arabness when it comes to issues like the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, for example. Many Muslims, Muslim visitors had this sense of support for sympathizing with the Palestinian cause. There was also that same issue had a pan-Islamic connotation, because the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is also considered to be a pan-Islamic issue, since the majority of Muslims have spiritual ties to the Al-Aqsa Mosque. These threads actually reflected some consensus, but that consensus, it's very important to realize that this consensus did not result from engaging in interpretation and consultation. It resulted from the fact that they were already in agreement on the issue to start with. And that's why it's not called a genuine consensus, in the sense that they didn't go through these rational critical debates. They reached the consensus out of the fact that they were already in agreement. So we cannot say that thanks to the virtual dialogue that they were engaged in, that they reached that consensus. The threads from Islam Way English, which is limited only to the sisters, as I mentioned earlier, was also mostly reflecting a collective sense of identity, Islamic identity. And this was mostly because the female participants felt that they are part of a big family. And these women became reluctant to offend their fellow sisters, and they provide and accept advice without being critical. This is what I like to call engaging in a utopian virtual community, or a gated spiritual community online. Okay. The last finding is that the threads from Islam Online English Forum, they were actually very confrontational, and they were very polemic. There was no sense of sincerity at all, no rational critical debates, and it was actually clear from these threads that there was a resistance to the other. The other here is perceived as vague, as strange, and even as dangerous. It refers not only to Muslims versus non-Muslims, but also to Sunnis versus Shias, and to men versus women. So, concluding remarks. There was an absence of traditional Muslim scholars that created a knowledge void on these threads. These websites reflected varying degrees of consensus and divergence. But the middle ground of negotiation was almost absent, except for very few threads. Consultation in the context of these forums has opened the door, as I said earlier, for lay people with no religious qualifications to set the agenda for what Islam is about. And I want to end with one final remark here. It's easier to say that these online discussion forums can be utilized as diplomacy tools to fight the aggressive Islamophobia in the United States today, especially in the US media. Starting from incidents like the threat to burn the Quran to the controversy surrounding the so-called Ground Zero mosque, so-called because it's not actually on Ground Zero. It's near Ground Zero, but not on Ground Zero. To the latest Senate hearings about what they called Islam and radicalization. I think it's these websites can be good platforms for Muslims and non-Muslims to engage in this constructive dialogue. But again, it's easier said than done. I really hope to see a dialogue that raises the bar of discourse and appreciates the common realities among us. And in this dialogue, the US officials need to understand that they do not have the authority to decide what the right Islam is. It's up to the Muslims themselves to set the standards for how Islam ought to be practiced in today's world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was a very enlightening discussion, and I'm sorry that our colleague Jihad Turk had to leave. So usually when I speak publicly, as many of you know, when you speak, you tell a story about what happened on your way to an event. Things have changed these days. The way that I encompass or deal with my world is often through social media. So a funny thing happened to me on my way here with Twitter. So for those of you that are live tweeting, the hashtag is FD2011, if any of you are live tweeting from this event. So yesterday I decided I wanted to just ask a question via Facebook and Twitter. How do we frame a dialogue on religious minority rights in Muslim majority countries? So I was really intrigued to see the responses to that question. One of the things that I do when I engage in social media, instead of using a prescriptive mode of inquiry, even though I went to law school, you would think the Socratic method has some prescriptive elements to it, I asked the question, and I was surprised to see that in addition to one of the things that my colleague Muhammad Nawawi, Dr. Nawawi has mentioned, there's a reframing of the epistemology that Muslims are utilizing. One of my most retweeted tweets was a quote from Washington Irving, and it was mostly Muslims that retweeted it. So not only is it a question of Muslims reframing a movement away from traditional Muslim scholars, it's also a challenging in the peer networking, not through the site that delivers, but through social media, through Twitter and Facebook. We're seeing a sense of spiritual formation that comes not just from traditional Muslim scholars or even from Muslims, but potentially from other sources that were not viable or open in previous times. So I wanted to put that on the table as well. I think that's something we need to think about, is that not just the ummah that is transnational, but the created peer ummah that's coming out of especially youth culture. So I wanted to mention that really briefly. And one other element that has a limitation to our discussion today that I felt is a thread that has run through our analysis is often the idea of religion and comes from a very Christian lens. And so even as we were discussing, as I was thinking about religion and the internet, there is this part of the revolutions that are happening in the Middle East are a very spiritual movement for those that are experiencing it. So if one sees praying and one sees also commitment to nonviolence, it's assumed that they're antithetical because the lens that we put on such a movement is either secular or religious. And there's a space that is created when we have a non-Christian religion engaging in the construction of this dialogue. So the lens that we use, recasting a traditional Christian lens, is one that will challenge our analysis, and I think will enhance our analysis as well. So that's a precursor to what I was going to speak about, which is the exploration of engagement for Muslims in transnational governance bodies such as the United Nations and humanitarian efforts. This is from a book chapter that I have that's coming out in an edited volume by Glenn Stassen. As you know, he has the 10 steps of just peacemaking. Again, it's from a Christian epistemological as well as hermeneutic principles, and Muslim and Jewish scholars were asked to respond, so I will respond, but it is essentially a response. So I mentioned that again, that is often the dynamics of the conversations between religions. So I'm responding in particular to his Norm 8, which is the imperative to engage with the transnational bodies such as the United States. And in order to do so, from a Muslim lens, we must investigate texts of Islamic origin to determine whether such guidance exists for this directive. First, one must consider the issues of how Islamic theology and law have focused on the rule of law in general. Second consideration must be given to whether there is a place for post-conflict humanitarianism, and finally, how Muslim communities might be engaged in the pursuit of post-conflict transnational humanitarianism in the modern world. So let's spend a little bit of time on rule of law in the primary texts from Islam. While there are diverse schools of thought that relate both to law and politics within the Muslim tradition, there's a clear deference given to the notion that a society must be ruled by some form of authority that has an integrated sense of public engagement. At the very inception of Prophet Muhammad's mission, the Quran commanded him to utilize sound methodology for governance, and even though he was in possession of a divine message, he must reach out to others for consultation. Thus, his authority could not be unchecked. From the Quran, chapter 42:38, and their rule is by counsel among themselves. And then chapter 4, verse 58, Allah commands you to make trust to those worthy of them, and that when you judge between people, you judge with justice. In these two verses, we see the early formations of the rule of law that was paramount over the Prophet's personal preferences. His mission was a complex one that included community governance, faith, and faith-based guidance of his flock. From these verses and many other traditions, the impending separation after the death of the Prophet of the leader of faith and government, one might say, was being set so that the rule of law might guide decisions of future leaders. Many scholars have commented on the fact that the religious leadership and state leadership have throughout many periods of Islam actually been separate entities. Not always. There have been periods in which that was the case. The scholars were not the ones making political decisions, nor vice versa, as a form of checks and balances for one authority upon the other. Khalid Abul Fadl discusses the fact that political legitimacy was not a legal issue, and jurists, we will see, were willing to concede this point to the rulers in his text, Rebellion and Violence in Islamic Law. Prophet Muhammad, in fact, designated others as leaders, anticipating perhaps the need for Muslims to choose leaders and establish the rule of law with the understanding that order must be developed by mechanisms of government. Abu Burda said, the messenger of God sent Abu Musa and Mu'adh ibn Jabal to Yemen, and he appointed each of them to govern a part of Yemen. And he said, Yemen is divided into two parts. Then he said, be gentle to the people, be not hard on them, make them rejoice, and do not incite them to aversion. I'm going to be quoting some hadith, which are sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. The rule of law of a state should be challenged, however, not by violence, but by discourse and discussion, according to some scholars. Ibn Abbas said, the Prophet said, he who dislikes the order of his emir, of his ruler, should withhold himself from opposition, for he who rebels against the rule of law by a span dies in a state of jahiliyyah, or ignorance. In fact, some people have looked at this teaching as the reason that there have not actually been a lot of rebellions against states within the Muslim world. Clearly, the obedience to rule of law was paramount to the discourse of the Prophet's own rhetoric.
However, if one does disagree, and obedience to injustice is being called for, then what should be the ways to respond to those who are in authority? Abu Sa'id said, the Prophet said, the most excellent jihad is the uttering of truth in the presence of an unjust ruler. The most excellent jihad was just here, he's also excellent. The most excellent of jihad is the uttering, there's someone even more excellent than him. The most excellent of jihad is the uttering of the truth in the presence of an unjust ruler. Ma'aqil said, I heard the Prophet say, there is not a man whom God grants to rule people that then he does not manage their affairs for good, but he will not smell the sweet odor of paradise. So in fact, Muslims are promised paradise for many reasons, not just for 72 virgins. Further, you got that joke, right? Okay. Yeah. Further, there was a clear understanding that there would be an emergence of a distinction among countries. Al-Mawardi, who lived from 974 to 1058, discussed the idea of countries of Islam were divided. This is just the countries within Islam were divided into three categories: the holy precincts, the Hijaz, and everything else. Different sets of rules that applied to each region regarding property bore witness to the fact that there was clarity that laws must be localized to the regions of the jurisdiction. Further, any of you who are familiar with the sources or principles of Islamic jurisprudence of fiqh know that urf or custom became actually a methodology that Muslims use in addition to their primary text, both to interpret the text but also actually as a source of doctrine and teachings. They are not just hermeneutic tools, they were also sources, and there are many requirements that are set if you want to use custom, but in fact we're seeing more and more that is an issue that needs to be dealt with in modern jurisprudence. So, a system of governance that promotes mutual consultation, counsel, and engagement of others, compacts for establishing justice, and methods for dissent that did not pose physical harm could have been at the heart of a paradigm that emanated from Muslims. Engaging with a transnational body perhaps may not be a contradiction for followers of Islam. The body must typify the above stated norms: affirmative duty for promoting positive rule of law, norms for engagement that allow consultation between those within the system, and acknowledgement of the need for political jurist separation, allowance for dissenting voices within the discourse, and clearly designated mechanisms for voicing disagreement, especially as it relates to those who feel that rulings are unjust. So I am going to bring it a little bit to the modern world. As you can imagine, 1,400 years is a lot to cover. So I wanted to speak a little bit about post-conflict humanitarianism, especially as we are speaking today, we're exploring the notion of public diplomacy. If one of the major functions of the United Nations is to prevent conflict and to provide for post-conflict needs of nation-states, then again we must investigate the Muslim traditions to bring to light whether or not these are compatible goals. Peacemaking is explored in other chapters of this book, which I guess you have to buy the book when it comes out, so we will not expound on this topic, but to say that the prevention of conflict is key to the practice of Islam as many see it. For example, the believers are but brethren, so make peace between your brethren, from the Quran, chapter 42, verse 10. Now a hadith. Jarir said, the Messenger of Allah said, Allah has no mercy, or God has no mercy on him who is not merciful to men. The notion of reconciliation is a way of life for those who follow the traditions of the Prophet and built into the fabric of Muslim social and religious cultures. The aspect of provision for those who are left without after a conflict is also integrated into the text and history and teachings of Muslims. Righteousness is that one should believe in Allah or God and give away wealth out of love for Him to the near of kin, to the orphans and the needs and the wayfarer and the beggars, and for the emancipation of captives. Chapter 2, verse 17. When approached by companions, Prophet Muhammad was asked, what is the best form of Islam? The Prophet replied, to feed the poor and to give salutation or salam to people that you don't know. So that's the best form of Islam in one of the hadith. So I'll wrap up right now. Modern Muslim scholars such as Muhammad Asad in the Principles of State and Government in Islam recognize a theological basis for this charitable notion. If some readers suppose that the idea of a social insurance scheme is an invention of the 20th century, I would remind them that it was in full swing many centuries before the present term was coined, even before the need for it became apparent under the impact of modern industrial civilization, named the Islamic Commonwealth at the time, and so he goes on to talk about that. Charity extended to those who were not Muslim as well. It was reported by Asma after a conflict that her mother, who was not Muslim, was in need, and the Prophet instructed her to provide for her needs. There is a complex, healthy, and lively debate amongst Muslim scholars in the current era regarding the notion of what ethical obligations Muslims have towards those of other faiths. Anne Elizabeth Meyer delineates the varying degrees to which modern Muslim scholars adhere to the view that international humanitarian law and Islamic principles are compatible or not. She outlines the example of Lebanese scholar Subhi Mahmasani, who put, my Arabic pronunciation is worse than yours, who pulls on tolerant and egalitarian strains from early Islamic traditions and practices and discards any features of Sharia that would be incongruous with the scheme of international human rights. Certainly there is much more to explore. For instance, 3 questions that one must pose. What is the resolution of modern interpretations that have allowed Muslim scholars to the right to engage in political rule? And how does this limit the applicability or commitment to international law? I mentioned here things like vilayat al-faqih, the notion of the scholar's transcendence or omnipresence in political decision-making. If scholars do draw on interpretations that are seen as more related to peaceful coexistence that do exist in text, will such rulings be viewed as culturally relevant and indigenous to the Muslim community by its own religious adherents? What remains of the thrust by some Muslim scholars and movements that demand the existence of an Islamic state for the practice of Islam? Is it possible for the notion of civil religion to find a space in the modern Muslim discourse that creates a venue within such supererogatory regimes such as the UN for Muslims to remain grounded in the values of their traditions while fully participating in the exercise of international human rights law and humanitarian actions? Briefly, I wanted to speak about the Cairo Declaration. The Cairo Declaration was presented in the 1993 Conference on Human Rights and was endorsed by the OIC. There remain ongoing tensions regarding the CHDRI and the UNDHR. Mayer points out the basic difference between the CDHRI use of the word dignity and obligation versus the UNDHR use of the word rights for all humans. In her estimation, the drafters of the CDHRI did not attend a legal equivalence between the varying definitions of what these documents are protecting. Furthermore, the CDHRI has been criticized for the distinction in the calculus of measuring equality for men and women and lack of clarity of protecting minority rights within Muslim majority rule. Mayer and others have acknowledged that independent Muslim human rights advocacy, apart from that which is exercised by... Mayer points out that it is important to support international independent Muslim human rights advocacy apart from that which is exercised by national governments. I don't have a chance here, but I came up with some recommendations on engaging non-governmental organizations and religious education. So I'll wrap up at this point if there are questions.
Thank you. All right, so Phil has said that we can take 5 minutes more than we would have otherwise, so we can go till about 5 after 1, which gives us about 12 minutes for discussion. So, okay, 10 after.
We were a good panel, abided by the time.
Yes, you did. Actually, Jihad was not so excellent in that respect. He took more time than he was supposed to have. But there are only 2 of you left, so that, the time is divided among fewer people. Anyway, so questions? Yes.
Hi, I wanted to ask a question as you were talking about... Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
As you were mentioning about the websites and engaging through social media, you also mentioned that some of the contexts in which it was being engaged was somewhat, the language was somewhat extreme, or I don't know how else to frame it. But would you say that some of it relates to the culture or even the nature of the language? Because even those who speak Arabic, Arabic is a very passionate language, a very emotional way of expression. So to what extent is it that? And to what extent is it working to build capacity for communities to engage in dialogue? And I ask that because this is even something that we see locally, working with immigrant groups or working with groups who have not necessarily engaged in dialogue, to work through building capacity to get to those points. So if you can elaborate a little bit on that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah. When I talked about the language, I talked about it in terms of it being a barrier. So some of those threads actually had mostly visitors who were native Arabic speakers. So this excluded automatically the non-Arabic speakers from these threads. But there was also the other issue of using colloquial language to Arabic to communicate, especially in threads where people knew each other. We sensed that some threads had really this intimate environment where many visitors were visiting frequently, and so they knew each other. Some of them were like an Egyptian group, a Palestinian group. But believe me, if someone wanted to get his message across, they would use classical Arabic. The other thing is the use of profanities. We saw the use of profanities on both English and Arabic threads, and that was definitely something that was very striking, especially given the fact that there was hardly any moderation. The moderators would intervene only when it reaches a point that is just unbearable in terms of, and they would just totally drop the whole thread without really explaining why they just dropped the whole thread. So there was either total absence on the part of the moderators, or when they intervened in a way that was really not acceptable by the other people who were not using these profanities. Does that address your question?
And also, I wanted to add really quickly, because you talked about Fusha or classical Arabic. Part of the paper that I was going to finish highlights programs that cross-pollinate across religious scholars and secular education. I think one of the greatest areas of potential investment is the rising civil society movement needs to have an integration with religious scholars, so that religious teaching and religious learning, and some of the best, I think, programs that we've seen internationally are those that do that as well, that bring together. Often in many communities there are excellent religious schools, but in others basic human rights definitions are not part of the vernacular of religious education. So that was part of my proposal or recommendation, is to cross-pollinate with equal respect a conversation between both educational institutions that represent different sectors.
If I may add one more thing, of course the Egyptian dialect is very common, is very familiar in the Arab world, and so someone like Amr Khalid, for example, despite the fact that he uses mostly colloquial Arabic, Egyptian Arabic, that he still has following from across the Arab world, because people are familiar with the dialect through the Egyptian movies and soap operas. And
yes, please.
Yes, I'm Consul General from Pakistan.
What, just one moment, let her get you the microphone.
Yeah. Thank you. I've been here since the morning, and I've listened to the previous panel and yours as well. I missed most of Douglas's speech. I'm sorry about that. I'll talk to you about it later. But one thing that I've sort of come to the conclusion of is that, it is, there is a great deal of intolerance in a society which I feel, I'm talking about the United States, and I'm talking about the Western world, where it's a dichotomy, where you have a higher level of achievement, a higher level of education, a more progressive and a modern so-called society, yet you see the levels of intolerance are perhaps just as great as they are in a society, say like mine in Pakistan, where the level of education is much, much lower. The social development is much lower. So it's very difficult for somebody from my part of the world to quite understand why this is going on. Why is there this growing degree of intolerance in a place as diverse and as pluralistic as the United States? And you've pointed it out in various ways. Previous speakers also spoke about it. To me, perhaps it's, of course, ignorance and fear of the unknown is just the basic thing. But there's, I think, much more than that. And I feel that it's very, very important for all of us to be more and more engaged with each other and understand and learn. Because, for example, you mentioned the burning of the Quran. Well, actually, it did take place. It took place on the 21st of March in Florida. They managed to burn a copy of the Quran. It didn't come into the media like it had previously. Only, I think, 30 people that were at the church when this happened. But it did actually happen. And so I think that it's very important to engage in that way. And I'd like to also mention the role of the NGOs, which I think we haven't had the opportunity so much. You know, I have a problem also with the role of the NGOs to a certain extent. And I feel that that's where the governments have actually failed. And being a diplomat, I mean, I hold responsibility for that, the government as well. We find that at times of at a disaster, a natural disaster, or in times of need, or in times of trouble, the first people or group that goes out to reach out to the locals are the NGOs. And whereas many of them would also be doing a lot of good humanitarian work, would be actually reaching out and helping out the people, a lot of them also have agendas. And those agenda may not be very, very tolerant. So, for example, I mean, in the case of Pakistan, let me tell you that when the earthquake happened in 2005, we found that in the most remotest areas of Pakistan, there were NGOs working there who were also very extremist and fundamentalist in their interpretation of Islam. And yet, because they were the first to reach out there to those people, and then, of course, through that propagate their own views, the government, of course, was behind. So we have to really look at this. We have to see where the government fails and where NGOs get this ability to, the NGOs that are, say, the not very good ones, who go there and reach out to the people in the remotest areas and then propagate their own beliefs. And I think the Muslim community has a lot to do with that. So I think there has to be a movement amongst the Muslim community, Arab and non-Arab, the entire Muslim community, to make sure that governments are actually doing not falling back on their role and allowing radical NGOs to take on and in fact radicalize populations that way.
Do you want to respond to that?
I just want to say that I believe the Muslim community in the United States is not speaking up enough about their own religion. And I give you a concrete example of that. I was asked to organize sort of a workshop on how to write an opinion piece among the young Muslims, college students in particular, at the mosque I go to in Charlotte. And Charlotte has more than 5 mosques, but there is barely any kind of communication among the mosques themselves in a way that can really mobilize the whole Muslim community to speak up about the religion. But anyway, when I held that workshop, I invited the young people and I put the message on social media to submit opinion pieces. I talked to the editor at the Charlotte Observer I gave him an idea. He said, yeah, we rarely get any pieces from young Muslims. We don't know what they think, And I got only one submission. And that, ironically, that one was the only one, it went through. It made its way through the Charlotte Observer. It was published with her picture and everything. And so that really shows you how, I don't know what's going on. It's really either because the parents, I think it starts at home, maybe they don't instill that incentive to really for the younger generations to talk, to speak about their religion, and to really, when they see something wrong in the media or stereotypical, rather than just complaining, they have to actually take action. And
I would just add to that. I think since we're at a conference about public diplomacy, part of the disconnect when diplomats come from the United States, the names and the associations that we have with NGOs that we view, rightly so, as one might see as espousing violence, don't have the same branding or trademark in the local communities, because the way that it's seen at the very local level is, this is where I get my food from, this is where I get my clothes from. So when it comes to, as many of us know, the one man, one vote, one time theory, that might be one way to explain how that happens. And I think that disconnect needs to be addressed. I'm mentioning when there are elections, who gets elected is as Americans, our view of these organizations might be very different than how they play out on the ground. So that disconnect, I think, as you mentioned, is really important. I have to make a correction on social media. The hadith that I quoted just from your Twitter feed from the Center for Public Diplomacy, the hadith was not about rising up against regimes, it was about speaking out. So I think that's really important, because there's a big distinction between rising up and speaking out. Thanks. Okay.
All right. I'm sorry. There are a lot of hands out there. Suddenly everybody wants to ask questions, and we have 5 minutes left. So I think Phil has given me the directive. I may take one more, so if you have any wrath, you can direct it his way afterwards. But you had your hand up. Or we talked to the panelists at lunch, and this is the thing. We've got lunch coming up, so you'll have your opportunity to engage them further at that point. So we'll take the one last question here, and then.
I just have a question. My name's Mohammed Khan, and I've been involved for many years in multi-faith harmony as well as conflict resolution. Just on the web aspect, on your analysis, I'm just curious, how many people on the street have access to the internet? Because what we are observing globally is a war of inequality of food, clothing, and shelter. And there's a faith factor embedded in all of this, but what I'm more curious about is who really has the purchase power to go on the internet at their leisure on the Arab street?
That's a good question, because there are definitely variations. We cannot look at the Islamic world as one entity when it comes to new media use. Take a country like Egypt, for example. The internet use is between 23 and 25%. But that does not mean that, because I don't know how they calculate the internet penetration rates. You know, the Arab world, for example, has many cyber cafes where people who don't have access, cannot afford to have a computer at home or cannot afford to have internet access at home. They go to these cyber cafes and they pay very little amounts of money to access the internet. And I think with these revolutions taking place, I've been to Tahrir Square and I talked to young people who told me that because of this revolution, they are encouraged to have a Facebook account, for example. They are encouraged to go on Twitter. They are encouraged to feel that they are part of, they want to feel that their voice is being heard. And they feel that these social media tools are a way for them to actually get their voice across. And so I think, despite the fact that the Arab world used to have one of the lowest internet penetration levels, I think it also has the highest growth levels in the world. So I think this is also an interesting irony in that sense. But despite I definitely think that the internet penetration levels are going to go higher, and I think part of that is going to be for the governments themselves to spend more money on the infrastructure for the technology. You know, that hasn't been the case for the past few years, but hopefully with new regimes that can change.
I wanted to add just very briefly, it's important to keep in mind there are drawbacks to the internet revolution or the revolution on the internet. One might also see, if you looked at the video that a young Egyptian woman posted, the self-organized Habermasian space of the internet allows also for gender variables to open in a way that hopefully, and that's I think the question, that engagement that's happening across genders and inclusion of women, will that be replicated in what we call, for those of you that are familiar, in what we call real life versus second life? So anyways, I think that's interesting to me as well.
You're talking about the Egyptian young lady Asma Mahfouz.
Yeah, and whether that engagement that is happening online, we have to see whether that will translate into inclusion in government.
And by the way, this young lady now is also serving on the coalition, the youth coalition in Egypt, representing the April 6th movement. So
that's a function of that public space and inclusion of women that was self-organized and pushing those boundaries. So I think it'll be interesting to see if it continues.
Okay, well, I think we've reached the end of our time. Join me in thanking the panelists, and we will adjourn for lunch.
Lunch is right
Later,